There are few things quite as stirring as the rollicking symphonies of traditional African music and dance. The insistent pound of drums, softened by the rhythmic cha-cha of rattles, threaded through with the sensuous undulation of flutes, the tinkling pirouettes of xylophones, and the cascading melodies of stringed instruments. All of these animated by the call and response of resonantly harmonious singing and a colorful tableau of ever on beat bodies. It is a feast of color, sound, and movement. If the mass dancers, or jujus as we call them in my home country Cameroon, make an appearance, you are in for a bigger treat. Liberated from human limitations and elevated by the spirit of whichever entity their mass represent, these beings leap and skip, swirl, whirl, and swirl their way through the human and spirit realms, performing feats which sometimes transcend the possibilities of imagination. Masquerade dancers are not the only figures who push the limits of human imagination in traditional African dance performances. Across the continent, the dance arena is also a stage upon which regular people like you and I probe the boundaries of self expression, asserting with voice and movement and attire that a person can become whoever they need to be to meet the demands of a moment or a lifetime. In dance performances, a human can become a spirit, a commoner, a king, a noble, a servant, an adult, a child, a girl, a boy, and a man, a woman. In this week's episode of the Mythological Africans podcast, we continue our exploration of how cross dressing, that is, the practice of wearing clothing that is traditionally or stereotypically worn by people of another gender in a given culture, shows up in traditional African dance, particularly the Bamaya Dance of the Dagomba people in Ghana. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. The word Bamaya means the river valley is wet. By some accounts, Bamaya is one of the most popular musical and dance performances of the Dagomba of northern Ghana. It was certainly popular enough to be included in the routines of the National Dance Company of Ghana, the Ghana Dance Ensemble, created in 1962 by the Ghanaian government's Institute of Arts and Culture and the Institute of African Studies of the University of Ghana. The Bamaya dance is a religious performance traditionally performed only by men. However, the men's costumes consist of skirts and blouses, accessorized by anklets to create the rhythms that will accompany their dance, headgear with cowrie extensions to resemble earrings, and a waistband to accentuate the vigorous hip twisting and thrusting movements of the dance. Additional accessories include a fan and a towel. It is that serious. There are three stories in circulation that I am aware of about the origins of the Bamaya dance. The first begins in the 19th century when a drought hardened the lands of the Dagomba, drying rivers and streams and leaving granaries dusty and empty. Male rainmakers made sacrifices to their land god Tingbana in vain, and so desperate, Dagomba men resolved that perhaps prayers by women to Tingbana would get a faster response. Interestingly, however, instead of calling on the women to perform the dances, they dressed in women's clothing and followed the head priest to the grove in which Tingbana lived. There, the men danced, twisting their hips vigorously, singing and pleading with Tingbana so earnestly. The god was moved by the plight of the women and, in response, sent down an abundant rainfall, flooding the river valleys with water, hence the name. The expression Bamaya then is an expression of gratitude and joy on behalf of the dancers who brought the plentiful rains. In another version of this story, the drought and the famine was caused by a man who so brutally maltreated his wife, he deeply offended the gods who then cursed the land. And so, to humble the men and deter other men from behaving as he did, the gods declared that all men in the village had to dress like women, hence the Bamaya costume. In yet another version of the Bamaya dance's origins, a hungry but poor man decides to steal food, and so he disguised himself as a woman in order to gain access to the market, traditionally a women's space. He was, however, caught in the act of stealing a chicken, and the woman who caught him cried out to alert the authorities to his ruse and theft. The man's desperate antic was so memorable, the people decided to memorialize it in a dance, hence, once again, the dressing. This version of the account posits that the dance troupe includes a female singer who, in the story, is the person who alerted the authorities, and in the dance performance acts as a crier who calls out the refrains. Which of these stories is true? I don't know. But it's hard to miss the underlying tensions, misogyny, and gender conflicts nestled in these stories. And those I will leave to the Dagomba and people better informed than myself to expand upon. Our discussion today will focus more on how these and the many other of such dances across the continent demonstrate that long before the concept of gender performance was popularized by Judith Butler, an American philosopher, and long before RuPaul made drag a household entertainment phenomenon, Africans, and I dare say most indigenous peoples of the world, understood the concept of gender as an assembly of practices and behaviors based on cultural norms of femininity and masculinity. In some communities, and there are enough examples of this across the continent for it to be more norm than exception, the boundaries around these gendered practices and behaviors were porous enough people felt comfortable crossing them temporarily or permanently. Now, the permanent crossing of gender boundaries, that is transgenderism in the African context, yes, it exists, will be the subject of another episode. What's most important to remember here is that when people did cross these gender boundaries, whether temporarily in a dance or other context, or permanently as in a complete lifestyle change, they were understood to be genuinely manifesting their inner realities, and so, where they were tolerated, their communities adjusted expectations accordingly. I emphasize where they were tolerated because there is also ample evidence that while some traditional African communities fully embrace people who cross gender boundaries, others held them in as much contempt as some people do today. Back to our topic though, dance performances. Dance is one of the major arenas in which men, in particular, had the freedom to perform femininity, whether playfully or as part of a ritual with associated symbolisms. During these performances, the male dancers shrug off ideas of what and who a man should be and allow the spirit of the moment or the dance or the general performance to dictate their behavior. They were essentially transformed into women while remaining men, and where these dances are still performed, that remains the case. Many mask performances in which men wear masks which represent women will focus on the respective communities' ideals about feminine beauty and comportment. What this means is that there were certainly questionable beliefs being propagated. Among the Baole of Cote d'Ivoire, for example, men traditionally commissioned masks to represent women they admired for their beauty and their skills, especially in dance and in their other performances. While the men performed the dances, they hailed these women and called out their beauty and their skills and other attributes that they thought were desirable, essentially modeling for the women and young girls present what they expected from them. Interestingly, however, it is understood that Baule women only accepted a man's performance if they felt that he accurately represented them and their aspirations. So, what it sounds like then is that these dances were a subtle form of communication through which men could, in a type of embodied empathy, step into a woman's skin as part of an immersive negotiation of gender roles in a community. By some accounts, after the Bauli women critiqued the men's misconceptions and unrealistic expectations about their behavior, a critique that could even involve them heckling or driving off bad performers or those with incorrect ideas, the men eventually presented a revised performance with a version of womanhood adequately calibrated by the women's feedback. And there are similar dance performances and interactions among the Chokwe, the Lunda, and the Luvale of Central Africa. On the East African coast, the Mwaka Oga festival celebrated in Zanzibar is a harvest festival come New Year's party intended to remove the unhealthy tensions that have built up in the community over the year. One of the main events of these festivities involves the women and men of the community, some of whom are dressed as women, chasing one another with sugarcane sticks and beating one another while crowds of people watched and cheered. The sad thing is that the encounter between traditional African beliefs and practices and European colonialism, especially thinking about where Europeans were at during that time in the 1800s and the 1900s, resulted in a setup where a lot of people were led to believe that these practices and dances and ceremonies and ways of being were just plain wrong. So even their positive potentialities were suppressed because perhaps there were aspects of them which didn't jive with what the European mindset thought was proper moral behavior, or there were aspects of them that were harmful to the human person in principle. So it's important to keep these things in mind. And we are just scratching the tip of how gender fluidity and cross dressing showed up in African dance and other performances. There are examples from just about every part of the continent, in just about every context you can imagine, from light-hearted play to solemn funerals and crucial community rituals. The one thing I will suggest, however, friends, is to best understand gender fluidity and cross dressing in the African context. It would really be helpful to unshackle it from the sexual undertones it almost always carries these days. Again, this is not to say that cross dressing in the African context never has sexual undertones. Absolutely not. Matter of fact, I believe that traditionally, many gender fluid Africans gravitated towards these dances and other such performances because it was a sanctioned area in which they could fully be themselves, right? So if you were a transgender person, for example, and this was the only sanctioned way in your community that you could just be yourself, or if you were a femme presenting gay man, if this was the only way in which you could be your full self, of course, this is where you would gravitate to. So over time, these dances became associated with people of non-heterosexual orientation. Meanwhile, their deeper symbolic or ritual meanings applied to the whole community. So we will stop here for this week. But when we return next week, we will continue the discussion further into the realm of cross dressing as it shows up in traditional African theatrical performances, as part of funeral rites, and more. As always, thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.